In the heart of a bustling city, where tall buildings cast long shadows across narrow streets, lived a bright-eyed 7-year-old girl named Joy with her mother Rose. Their small apartment might not have had much, but it was filled with love, laughter, and the sweet smell of Rose's famous apple pie that she baked every Sunday. Rose worked 2 jobs to keep their little world turning. During the day, she worked as a hospital cleaner, and in the evenings, she helped at a local diner. Despite her exhausting schedule, she never failed to tuck Joy in at night, telling her stories about brave princesses who changed their kingdoms with kindness and wisdom. Joy was different from other children her age. She noticed things that others might miss, like how her mother's smile would sometimes tremble when she looked at bills, or how she would skip meals saying she wasn't hungry. But Joy also inherited her mother's strength, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that made their elderly neighbors often remark that she had an old soul in a young body. Their peaceful life took an unexpected turn one rainy Tuesday afternoon. Rose was working her usual shift at the hospital when she found an expensive phone left behind in one of the rooms she was cleaning. Following protocol, she immediately turned it into the lost and found department. However, the next day, security cameras mysteriously stopped working during the time the phone went missing, and Rose found herself being accused of theft. The hospital's management, despite Rose's 5 years of spotless service record, decided to believe the wealthy patient who claimed Rose had stolen the phone. They terminated her employment immediately. What made matters worse was that the patient, an influential businessman, decided to press charges, claiming the phone contained sensitive business information. Joy watched as her mother's world began to crumble. Their savings quickly dwindled, and Rose struggled to find new work with theft allegations hanging over her head. The whispers in their apartment building grew louder, and some parents started preventing their children from playing with Joy. But through it all, Rose maintained her dignity, telling Joy, "Sometimes life tests us, baby, but we must never let it break our spirit." The local legal aid office assigned them a young public defender named Mrs. Chen, who believed in Rose's innocence but warned them that it would be challenging to prove. The security footage gap made the case complicated, and the businessman's expensive lawyers were pushing for a harsh sentence to set an example. As the court date approached, Joy noticed her mother crying silently at night when she thought Joy was asleep. The little girl began spending time in their building's small library, reading everything she could about courts and justice. She didn't understand all the big words, but she understood enough to know that truth needed evidence to shine. One evening, while helping her mother sort through old papers for Mrs. Chen, Joy remembered something important. On the day of the incident, she had drawn a picture of her mother at work, something she often did while waiting for Rose to finish her shift. The drawing showed her mother cleaning rooms, and in the corner, Joy had written the time and date, just like her teacher had taught her to do with all her artwork. That simple drawing, created by a child's loving hands, would soon become more valuable than anyone could have imagined. But as Joy held the paper, carefully preserved in her school folder, she didn't yet know that her habit of paying attention to details would help unravel a truth that would change everything. The story was far from over, and as Joy went to bed that night, holding her mother's hand tighter than usual, she couldn't have known that her own courage would soon be tested in ways she never expected. The courthouse, with its imposing columns and marble floors, was waiting, and within its walls, a little girl's voice would soon rise above prejudice and power to protect the person she loved most in the world. The morning of the first court hearing arrived with a heavy mist hanging over the city. Joy woke up earlier than usual, carefully smoothing out her favorite yellow dress, the one her mother had bought her for her last birthday. She found Rose already awake, sitting at their small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. "Mama, we need to eat breakfast," Joy said firmly, channeling the tone her mother usually used with her. "Mrs. Chen said we need to be strong today." She proceeded to make them both toast, standing on her tiptoes to reach the bread box, her small face set with determination. Rose watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartache, amazed at how their roles had somehow reversed in these difficult times. At the courthouse, they met Mrs. Chen, who looked tired but confident. She had spent countless hours preparing their case, touched by Rose's unwavering honesty and Joy's unwavering faith in her mother. The young lawyer had discovered that the businessman, Mr. Thompson, had a history of making similar accusations against service workers, but previous cases had always been settled quietly out of court. As they waited outside the courtroom, Joy clutched her backpack tightly. Inside was her drawing, carefully protected in a plastic sleeve, along with her diary where she had been recording everything she could remember about that day. She had learned from her favorite detective shows that details were important, and she had been determined to remember everything. The courtroom was intimidating, with its high ceilings and wooden panels that seemed to absorb all warmth. Joy noticed how different people looked at her mother, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. Mr. Thompson sat on the other side with his team of lawyers, all wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than their entire apartment's rent. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting their case. They painted a picture of Rose as an opportunistic thief, someone who took advantage of her position to steal from patients. They emphasized the missing security footage, suggesting it was too convenient to be a coincidence. Joy felt her blood boil at every false word, but she remembered Mrs. Chen's advice about staying calm and dignified. Mrs. Chen's cross-examination was skilled and precise. She established Rose's excellent work history, her role as a single mother, and her immediate reporting of the found phone to Lost and Found. But the prosecution's reply was sharp. They claimed these could be tactics to appear innocent, and the missing footage still couldn't be explained. During a brief recess, Joy tugged on Mrs. Chen's sleeve. "I have something," she whispered, pulling out her drawing. Mrs. Chen examined it carefully, her eyes widening as she noticed the details Joy had captured, not just her mother cleaning rooms, but the specific time stamps and even the room numbers she had included in her childish but precise way. The young lawyer had discovered that the businessman, Mr. Thompson, had a history of making similar accusations against service workers, but previous cases had always been settled quietly out of court. As they waited outside the courtroom, Joy clutched her backpack tightly. Inside was her drawing, carefully protected in a plastic sleeve, along with her diary where she had been recording everything she could remember about that day. She had learned from her favorite detective shows that details were important, and she had been determined to remember everything. The courtroom was intimidating, with its high ceilings and wooden panels that seemed to absorb all warmth. Joy noticed how different people looked at her mother, some with sympathy, others with suspicion. Mr. Thompson sat on the other side with his team of lawyers, all wearing expensive suits that probably cost more than their entire apartment's rent. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting their case. They painted a picture of Rose as an opportunistic thief, someone who took advantage of her position to steal from patients. They emphasized the missing security footage, suggesting it was too convenient to be a coincidence. Joy felt her blood boil at every false word, but she remembered Mrs. Chen's advice about staying calm and dignified. Mrs. Chen's cross-examination was skilled and precise. She established Rose's excellent work history, her role as a single mother, and her immediate reporting of the found phone to Lost and Found. But the prosecution's reply was sharp. They claimed these could be tactics to appear innocent, and the missing footage still couldn't be explained. During a brief recess, Joy tugged on Mrs. Chen's sleeve. "I have something," she whispered, pulling out her drawing. Mrs. Chen examined it carefully, her eyes widening as she noticed the details Joy had captured, not just her mother cleaning rooms, but the specific time stamps and even the room numbers she had included in her childish but precise way. The young lawyer quickly realized the significance. The drawing placed Rose in a completely different wing of the hospital at the exact time the phone went missing. More importantly, Joy had drawn the distinctive cart her mother used, which was signed out to specific sections each day, something that could be verified through hospital records. When court resumed, Mrs. Chen requested permission to call an unexpected witness. The judge, intrigued by the sudden development, allowed it. Joy walked to the witness stand, her yellow dress bright against the dark wood, her step small but steady. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, but she focused on her mother's face, drawing strength from the love she saw there. "Joy," Mrs. Chen began gently, "can you tell us about this drawing?" With a clear voice that carried through the hushed courtroom, Joy explained her after-school routine. How she would wait for her mother, doing homework and drawing pictures of her at work. She described how her teacher had taught their class about journaling and dating their work, and how she had applied this to her drawings. "And why did you draw this particular picture?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Because Mama was cleaning extra careful that day," Joy replied. "She told me someone important was staying in that wing, and everything had to be perfect. I remember because she was humming her happy song while she worked. She always hums when she's trying to do her very best." The simplicity and innocence of her testimony struck a chord with everyone in the courtroom. But it was the details she had unknowingly captured that proved most valuable. Mrs. Chen quickly brought in hospital records that confirmed Rose's card assignment to that wing, and the timing matched perfectly with Joy's dated drawing. As Joy stepped down from the witness stand, she caught Mr. Thompson shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyers were whispering urgently among themselves, papers rustling as they reassessed their strategy. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had been taking careful notes, was looking at the businessman with new scrutiny. But for Joy, the most important thing was the look of hope that had returned to her mother's eyes. It wasn't just the evidence she had provided, it was the way she had spoken her truth, clear and strong, just like Rose had always taught her to do. The little girl who noticed everything had done more than just help build a defense. She had shown everyone in that courtroom the power of a child's pure, unshakable faith in justice and love. The day wasn't over, and there were still questions to be answered. But as Joy returned to her seat, holding her mother's hand tightly, she knew that something had shifted in their favor. The truth, preserved in a child's careful drawing, was finally beginning to emerge, and with it, the hope for justice that they had been praying for. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically after Joy's testimony. Mr. Thompson's legal team called for another recess, their confident demeanor noticeably shaken. During the break, Joy sat in the courthouse hallway with her mother, sharing the sandwich their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Washington, had packed for them that morning. "Baby, you did so well in there," Rose whispered, smoothing Joy's hair with trembling hands. "No matter what happens, I want you to know how proud I am of you." Joy leaned into her mother's touch, thinking about all the times Rose had been strong for her. Now it was her turn to be strong for her mama. Mrs. Chen spent the recess making urgent phone calls, her voice low but excited. She had requested emergency access to the hospital's employee assignment records for the day in question. The drawing had given them something concrete to investigate, and she wasn't going to waste this opportunity. When court resumed, there was a new face in the room, Mr. Patterson, the hospital's head of maintenance. Mrs. Chen had managed to subpoena him during the recess. He carried a thick folder of documents and looked uncomfortable as he took the stand. As the person responsible for all cleaning staff assignments, his testimony could either confirm or contradict the story told by Joy's drawing. "Mr. Patterson," Mrs. Chen began, "could you please verify the cleaning card assignment records for May 15th? She handed him a copy of Joy's drawing, now marked as evidence. The maintenance supervisor adjusted his glasses, comparing the room numbers in the child's drawing to his records. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice growing stronger. "These records show that cart B7 was indeed assigned to the East Wing that day, and that cart was signed out to Rose Thompson for the afternoon shift." He paused, shuffling through more papers. "What's interesting is that the cart log shows it remained in that wing until the end of her shift at 6 p.m. The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. These records weren't part of the original evidence submission." But the judge, noting the time-sensitive nature of the case and the new developments, allowed the testimony to continue. Mr. Patterson went on to explain the hospital's strict policy about cleaning carts. Each cart had to remain in its assigned section due to infection control protocols. Any deviation would trigger an immediate report. There were no reports filed that day. As the testimony continued, Joy noticed something strange. Mr. Thompson was writing furiously on a notepad, his face growing redder by the minute. His lawyers kept trying to get his attention, but he seemed lost in his own world of increasing agitation. Mrs. Chen then called another surprise witness, Ms. Rivera, a nurse who had been working in the East Wing that day. She had come forward after hearing about the case from her colleagues. Though she hadn't been involved in the original investigation, she had something important to share. "I remember that afternoon clearly," Ms. Rivera testified. "Rose was cleaning the rooms as usual. I particularly noticed her because she was humming while she worked. Something about it made me smile. But what I remember most was Mr. Thompson himself." The courtroom fell silent. Mr. Thompson's head snapped up from his notepad. He came to the East Wing around 4:30 p.m., looking for his phone. He was checking all the rooms, saying he might have left it there during his morning tests. I distinctly remember him searching the waiting area and then leaving empty-handed. This new testimony created a ripple effect in the courtroom. If Mr. Thompson had been searching for his phone in the East Wing, it contradicted his earlier statement about leaving it in the West Wing where he claimed Rose had stolen it. The prosecution team huddled together, whispering intensely. But before they could respond, something unexpected happened. Mr. Thompson suddenly stood up, his face now a deep shade of red. "Enough," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "This is ridiculous. A child's drawing and some maintenance records shouldn't be able to destroy my reputation like this." His outburst caused a stir in the courtroom, and his lawyers tried desperately to quiet him. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order. But Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. In his agitated state, he made a crucial mistake. That phone had sensitive information, business deals that couldn't be traced. "When I realized I'd left it behind, I had to do something." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Mr. Thompson's lawyers looked horrified, and the prosecutor stood frozen, realizing their case had just imploded. Joy grabbed her mother's hand, watching as the truth she had known all along finally came to light. The judge called for immediate order, her voice cutting through the commotion. As the bailiff approached Mr. Thompson, who had collapsed back into his chair looking defeated, Joy felt tears rolling down her cheeks. But these weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, of justice finally being served. Mrs. Chen quickly moved to submit a motion for immediate dismissal of all charges against Rose. The prosecutor, after a moment of hesitation, stood up and declared that the state would be dropping all charges. Furthermore, he announced that they would be opening an investigation into Mr. Thompson's actions and his apparent attempt to frame an innocent woman. As the judge prepared to make her final statements, Joy looked around the courtroom. She saw Mrs. Chen's proud smile, Mr. Patterson's relieved expression, and Ms. Rivera nodding encouragingly. But most importantly, she saw her mother sitting tall, dignity restored, tears shining in her eyes but her head held high. The truth had prevailed, not through expensive lawyers or complex legal maneuvers, but through the pure, simple testimony of a child who paid attention, kept records in her own innocent way, and refused to let injustice win. Joy's drawing, created with love and preserved with care, had become the key that unlocked the truth and saved her mother from false accusations. The days following the dramatic court hearing brought waves of change for Joy and Rose. The morning after the trial, their small apartment was filled with the sweet aroma of fresh bread. Mrs. Washington from next door had baked them a whole basket full, saying it was her way of celebrating justice being served. The elderly woman hugged Joy tightly, whispering that she had never doubted Rose's innocence for a second. The hospital administration moved quickly to make amends. The director herself, Dr. Thompson, no relation to Mr. Thompson, she emphasized firmly, called Rose personally to offer her position back. But it wasn't just a simple reinstatement, they offered her a promotion to supervisor of the cleaning staff, acknowledging her proven integrity and dedication to her work. "We've been watching the case closely," Dr. Thompson explained during their meeting. "The way you handled yourself throughout this ordeal, maintaining your professionalism and dignity, that's exactly the kind of leadership we need." Rose sat in the pristine office, tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to words she never thought she'd hear. Meanwhile, Joy became something of a local hero at her school. Her teacher, Ms. Baker, used the story as a lesson for the entire class about the importance of paying attention to details and standing up for what's right. Joy's classmates, many of whom had been distant during the difficult times, now crowded around her desk during lunch, eager to hear the story firsthand. "But I was just doing what Mama always taught me," Joy would say, slightly overwhelmed by the attention. "She says we should always tell the truth and keep good records of important things." Her simple explanation made Ms. Baker smile, recognizing how profound life lessons often come wrapped in the most straightforward packages. The local newspaper ran a story about the case, focusing on how a child's drawing and testimony had unveiled the truth. Mrs. Chen was quoted saying it was one of the most remarkable cases of her career, not because of complex legal strategies, but because of the pure, unfiltered truth that came from a child's perspective. "Sometimes we get so caught up in the complicated aspects of law," Mrs. Chen told the reporter, "that we forget how powerful simple truth can be." Joy's drawing wasn't just evidence, it was a reminder that justice can come from the most unexpected sources. The story caught the attention of advocacy groups working to protect workers' rights. They reached out to Rose, asking her to share her experience at their meetings. At first, Rose was hesitant. Public speaking had never been her strong suit. But then she remembered how Joy had stood up in that courtroom, speaking her truth without fear. "If my baby can be brave for me," Rose told Mrs. Washington, "then I can be brave for others who might be going through similar situations." She agreed to speak at a community meeting, with Joy sitting in the front row, beaming with pride as her mother shared their story. Mr. Thompson's case took a different turn. The investigation into his actions revealed a pattern of attempting to frame service workers for theft, usually using the stolen items as leverage for insurance fraud. The district attorney's office was building a case against him, and several of his previous victims were coming forward with their stories. One evening, as Rose and Joy sat on their small balcony sharing a bowl of ice cream, a luxury they could now afford more often, Joy asked a question that had been on her mind. "Mama, are you angry at Mr. Thompson?" Rose thought carefully before answering, knowing her response would shape her daughter's understanding of forgiveness and justice. "No, baby. I'm sad that he chose to hurt people to get what he wanted. But being angry would only hurt us more. Instead, I'm grateful." "Grateful?" Joy asked, surprised. "Yes, grateful. This experience showed me how many people believe in goodness and truth. Mrs. Washington never doubted us. Mrs. Chen fought so hard for us. And you, my brave girl, you showed me that sometimes the biggest courage comes in the smallest packages." The apartment building's community also underwent a transformation. Neighbors who had avoided them during the accusations now stopped by with apologies and small gifts, homemade meals, hand-me-down books for Joy, offers to help with babysitting. Rose accepted their gestures with grace, understanding that people sometimes needed to learn their own lessons about judgment and prejudice. The hospital implemented new security measures, including better camera systems and more transparent protocols for handling lost items. Rose was consulted on these changes, her experience providing valuable insights into how to protect both patients and staff. Her new position allowed her to mentor other cleaning staff members, sharing not just professional knowledge but also the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of adversity. Joy's drawing became something of a legend in the courthouse. The judge had it framed and hung in her chambers, saying it served as a reminder that justice sometimes comes through the simplest means. Mrs. Chen kept a copy in her office too, using it to encourage other clients who felt powerless against a system that seemed too big to fight. As summer approached, Rose was able to reduce her working hours, no longer needing 2 jobs to make ends meet. This meant more time with Joy, helping with homework, cooking dinner together, and most importantly, listening to Joy's stories about her day. Their evening routine now included a new tradition. Joy would draw pictures of their day, carefully dating and labeling each one. "You never know," Joy would say with a wise smile, "when a drawing might be important." Rose would laugh and hug her daughter close, marveling at how this small person had taught her so much about courage, truth, and the power of paying attention to life's details. The case had changed them both, but not in the way hardship usually changes people. Instead of making them bitter or fearful, it had strengthened their belief in justice and the goodness of people. It had shown them that sometimes the smallest actions, like a child's careful documentation of her mother's workday, could have the biggest impact. 3 months after the trial, Joy and Rose's life had fallen into a new, more comfortable rhythm. Rose's promotion at the hospital had brought not just better pay, but also respect that she had earned twice over, first through her years of dedicated service, and then through her dignity during the false accusations. The morning staff meetings, once a source of anxiety, were now a place where her voice was heard and valued. One particular morning, Rose was reviewing cleaning protocols with her team when she noticed a new hire looking nervous and uncertain. The young woman, barely out of high school, reminded Rose of herself years ago. After the meeting, Rose took her aside. "The first few weeks are always the hardest," Rose said gently, helping the new employee adjust her cart. "But remember, every job you do matters, even if some people don't see it that way." She shared some of her own story, watching the young woman's eyes widen with recognition. "I read about you and your daughter in the paper," the new hire said. "It gave me hope that someone like us could win against someone so powerful." Rose smiled, realizing how their story had become a source of inspiration for others. Meanwhile, Joy's school life had taken an unexpected turn. Her teacher, Ms. Baker, had entered Joy's drawing, the one that had helped save her mother, in a citywide art competition. The category wasn't about artistic skill but about art that had made a real difference in Somme. "Your drawing shows that art isn't just about making pretty pictures," Ms. Baker explained to her class. "It's about capturing truth and telling stories that need to be told." Joy sat at her desk, finger-tracing the wood grain pattern as she absorbed her teacher's words. The art competition ceremony was held at the city's main library, a grand old building with marble columns that reminded Joy of the courthouse. This time, though, she wasn't afraid. She wore her yellow dress again, it had become her lucky charm, and held her mother's hand as they walked up the steps. Mrs. Chen came to support them, along with Mrs. Washington and several of their neighbors. Even Mr. Patterson from the hospital and Nurse Rivera had shown up, wanting to be part of this happier occasion. The community that had formed around them during their difficult times had stayed strong, becoming a network of genuine friendship and support. When Joy's drawing was announced as the winner in its category, the applause was thunderous. But it was the judges' comments that brought tears to Rose's eyes. "This simple drawing reminds us that children see truth more clearly than adults sometimes. Through a child's eyes, we see not just a mother at work, but dignity in every kind of labor, and the power of paying attention to the details that others might dismiss." The prize included art supplies and a scholarship fund for Joy's future education. But the real reward came afterward, when a group of young students from another school approached Joy, asking her to speak at their art club about how she used drawing to tell important stories. "I just draw what I see," Joy told them, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mama says that seeing clearly is the first step to doing what's right." The art teacher listening nearby quickly wrote down her words, knowing they held wisdom beyond Joy's years. Rose's role at the hospital continued to evolve. Dr. Thompson asked her to help develop a new training program for all service staff, focusing not just on job skills but also on understanding their rights and the proper procedures for reporting any issues they encountered. "Your experience showed us where our system failed," Dr. Thompson admitted during a planning meeting. But more importantly, it showed us how to make it better. Rose found herself in conference rooms she once only entered to clean, now sharing her insights with administrators and department heads. The hospital's new initiatives caught the attention of other healthcare facilities in the region. Rose was invited to speak at a healthcare workers' conference, sharing her story and the improvements that had grown from it. Joy insisted on helping her prepare, just as Rose had always helped her prepare for school presentations. "Remember to stand tall, Mama," Joy coached her the night before the conference, mimicking Rose's own words back to her. "Your story matters." Rose hugged her daughter tight, amazed at how their roles so often seemed to switch now, each taking turns being the other's strength. The conference speech was a success, but what touched Rose most was the line of service workers who came up to her afterward, sharing their own stories and thanking her for speaking up. Many of them had faced similar situations but had been afraid to fight back. Rose's story, they said, gave them courage to stand up for themselves. Back at home, their apartment had become a gathering place for the building's children. Rose and Joy hosted art afternoons where kids could draw and tell stories. Mrs. Washington would bring her famous cookies, and the parents would often join in, creating a warm community space filled with creativity and laughter. Joy started a special project during these gatherings, teaching other children how to date and label their artwork properly. "You never know when it might be important," she'd say with a smile, echoing her own experience. The other children took to it seriously, proud to be part of what they called the Truth-Telling Through Art Club. One evening, as Rose watched Joy helping a younger child hold a crayon correctly, she reflected on how their hardship had transformed into something beautiful. The false accusation that had threatened to destroy their lives had instead created ripples of positive change, in the hospital system, in their community, and in the way people viewed the importance of every person's dignity and truth. "Mama, look!" Joy called out, holding up a new drawing. It showed their apartment full of people, everyone smiling and creating art together. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, was the date and a title, "Our Family Gets Bigger Every Day." Rose looked around their living room, at the faces of neighbors who had become family, at the walls covered with children's artwork, each piece carefully dated and labeled, and at her daughter's bright smile. The truth that had saved them had also transformed them, showing them that sometimes life's hardest moments could lead to its most beautiful changes. 6 months after the trial, Joy's story had sparked a movement that nobody could have predicted. It began when a local education professor visited their art afternoon sessions, amazed by how the children were learning to document their daily lives through art. The professor, Dr. Harper, saw something special in the way Joy taught other kids to observe and record the world around them. "What these children are doing isn't just art," Dr. Harper explained to Rose one afternoon. "They're learning critical observation skills, documentation, and the importance of standing up for truth. These are valuable life skills that most adults struggle to master." She proposed starting a pilot program at Joy's school, calling it the Young Observers Initiative. Rose watched as her daughter's simple habit of drawing and dating her observations evolved into a structured program that taught children the importance of paying attention to details. The school principal, initially skeptical, became an enthusiastic supporter after seeing how the program improved students' engagement and confidence. Joy found herself at the center of this new movement, but she handled the attention with the same quiet dignity she'd learned from her mother. During one session, a shy boy named Tommy showed Joy his drawing of his father fixing cars at their family's garage. "See, I wrote down the time and date, just like you taught us," Tommy said proudly. "And I drew all the tools he uses because Daddy says those details matter." Joy nodded approvingly, remembering how her own attention to detail had made such a difference. The program's success caught the attention of the city's education board. Other schools began requesting information about implementing similar initiatives. Rose found herself accompanying Joy to different schools, sharing their story and helping set up their own Young Observers clubs. At one such presentation, an elderly teacher approached them with tears in her eyes. For years, I've been trying to teach children that their voices matter, she said. Your story shows them that even the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth. The impact wasn't limited to schools. The hospital where Rose worked had undergone its own transformation. The new training program she helped develop had become a model for other institutions. Healthcare workers from different hospitals would visit to learn about their improved systems and employee protection protocols. One day, Rose received a letter that made her hands tremble. It was from a cleaning staff member at another hospital who had faced a similar false accusation. The woman had remembered Rose's story and had taught her own daughter to keep detailed records of her workday. Those records had helped prove her innocence. Your daughter didn't just save you, the letter read. She showed all of us how to protect ourselves and our dignity. Rose shared the letter with Joy that evening, watching as her daughter's eyes lit up with the realization that her actions had helped someone she'd never even met. The art afternoons at their apartment had grown so popular that they had to move them to the building's community room. Mrs. Washington continued to bring her cookies, now aided by a rotating group of parents who brought snacks and art supplies. The walls of the community room became a gallery of children's observations, each drawing telling its own story of daily life in their neighborhood. Joy had started a special project with the younger children, teaching them to create truth journals, combinations of drawings and words that documented their daily observations. Sometimes the smallest things you notice can be the most important, she'd tell them, speaking from experience. The local library took notice of their activities and offered to host a special exhibition of the children's documented observations. The exhibition, titled Through Children's Eyes, Truth in Details, became an unexpected hit. Visitors were moved by the honest, detailed way the children captured their world. One particular drawing caught everyone's attention. It was by a 9-year-old girl who had documented workers fixing a broken swing in the park. Her detailed drawings and dates helped the city parks department identify when the repair work had been improperly done, leading to necessary corrections that made the playground safer for all children. Rose's role at the hospital continued to evolve. She was now part of a committee that reviewed workplace policies and procedures, ensuring they were fair and protected all employees. Her experience had given her unique insights into how power imbalances could be addressed and corrected within the system. We're not just changing policies, Rose explained during a committee meeting. We're changing the culture of how we treat each other. Her words resonated with administration and staff alike, leading to more open communication between all levels of hospital employees. The changes weren't always easy. Some people resistant to change would question why a former cleaning staff member was now involved in policy decisions. But Rose handled these challenges with the same grace she'd shown during her trial, letting her work and dedication speak for themselves. Joy, now recognized as the founder of the Young Observers movement, was invited to speak at a children's rights conference. Standing at the podium in her yellow dress, which Mrs. Washington had carefully altered as Joy grew, she spoke about how children's perspectives could help create positive change. We see things differently sometimes, Joy told the audience. And that's good because sometimes different is exactly what we need to find the truth. Her simple words earned her a standing ovation, but more importantly, they inspired a new generation of young observers. As the evening sun cast long shadows through their apartment windows, Rose and Joy sat together looking through a scrapbook of newspaper clippings, drawings, and letters from people they'd helped. The story that had begun with a single drawing had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. "Mama," Joy said, tracing the edges of her original court drawing, "remember when you used to tell me stories about brave princesses who changed their kingdoms with kindness and wisdom?" Rose nodded, remembering those bedtime stories from what seemed like a lifetime ago. "I think we're kind of like those princesses now," Joy continued. "We're helping change things, but not with magic, with truth and art and paying attention." Rose hugged her daughter close, marveling at how wisdom could come from such a young heart. Their story had indeed changed their little corner of the world, not through grand gestures or magical solutions, but through the simple power of truth, dignity, and a child's clear-eyed view of justice. 1 year after the trial that changed their lives, Joy and Rose received an invitation that left them speechless. The state Supreme Court was launching a new initiative focused on making the justice system more accessible and fair for everyone, especially children. They wanted Joy to be the face of their youth advocacy program. The invitation came through Mrs. Chen, who had continued to champion their cause long after their case was resolved. They want to learn from Joy's experience, she explained during a visit to their apartment. Her story shows how important it is to listen to children in the legal process. Rose sat at their kitchen table, reading the official letter while Joy leaned against her shoulder. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, remembering how far they'd come from those dark days when she thought she'd lose everything. Now, her daughter's courage was helping reshape the very system that had once seemed so intimidating. The Young Observers Initiative had spread beyond their city, reaching schools across the state. Teachers reported that students were becoming more engaged in their communities, more confident in speaking up, and more aware of the importance of documenting their observations. One school principal wrote to Joy about how a student's detailed drawings had helped resolve a bullying situation that adults had overlooked. "Your program taught our students that their perspectives matter," the principal's letter read. "They're not just learning to observe and document, they're learning to be responsible citizens who stand up for what's right." The hospital where Rose worked had become a model for employee relations in the healthcare industry. She now regularly hosted delegations from other hospitals, sharing how their improved systems had created a more trusting and efficient workplace. The cleaning staff, once seen as invisible, were now recognized as essential members of the healthcare team. One morning, as Rose conducted a training session for new employees, she noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was Mr. Patterson, the maintenance supervisor who had testified at her trial. He'd been transferred to another hospital but had come back specifically for this training. "I wanted to see how you transformed our mistake into something positive," he told her during the break. "You could have left bitter, but instead, you stayed and helped make things better for everyone." Rose smiled, remembering how his honest testimony had helped turn the tide in her case. Joy's art afternoons had evolved into a citywide program called Truth Through Young Eyes. Community centers across the city had adopted her model of combining art with observation and documentation. Children were learning not just to draw, but to see the world around them with more clarity and purpose. During one session at their community center, a young girl showed Joy her drawing of construction workers building a new playground. The detailed drawings included dates, times, and specific safety equipment the workers were using, or in some cases, not using. The documentation led to a safety review that potentially prevented accidents. "You taught us that our drawings can help keep people safe," the girl told Joy proudly. Joy hugged her, remembering her own drawing that had helped save her mother's career and reputation. The success of their story reached the national level when a major children's rights organization invited Joy and Rose to speak at their annual conference. The theme was "Every Voice Matters," and Joy's story was featured as a prime example of how children's perspectives could contribute to justice. Standing on the conference stage, Joy wore a new yellow dress. She had outgrown her lucky one, but Mrs. Washington had used fabric from the original to make a matching hair bow for the new one. Rose sat in the front row, watching her daughter address hundreds of educators, legal professionals, and child advocates. "I was just trying to help my mama," Joy began, her voice clear and confident. "But I learned that helping one person can end up helping many people. We all have the power to make things better, even if we're small." The simplicity and wisdom of her words brought the audience to their feet. The conference led to new opportunities for their message to spread. Educational publishers wanted to include their story in school textbooks. Child advocacy groups sought their input on making legal processes more child-friendly. Even the courthouse where their trial had taken place had established a special program to ensure children's voices were heard in legal proceedings. Back at home, their apartment building had become a symbol of community transformation. The art program had brought residents closer together, breaking down barriers of age, background, and culture. Mrs. Washington often remarked that the building felt more like a family now than just a place to live. And it all started with one little girl who paid attention, she would say, serving her famous cookies at their gatherings. The other residents would nod in agreement, remembering how their community had rallied around Rose and Joy during their difficult times. Rose's promotion to Director of Environmental Services at the hospital came as no surprise to anyone who had watched her work over the past year. Her experience had given her a unique perspective on how to create a workplace where every employee felt valued and protected. "Your mother showed us that leadership isn't about power," Dr. Thompson told Joy during the promotion ceremony. "It's about lifting others up and making sure every voice is heard." Joy beamed with pride, knowing that her mother had turned their challenge into an opportunity to help others. The Young Observers Initiative had unexpected benefits beyond its original scope. Teachers reported improved writing skills among students who participated, as they learned to describe their observations in detail. School counselors noticed increased empathy as children became more aware of others' experiences through their documentation projects. One afternoon, as Joy helped a group of children organize an exhibition of their observation journals, she found herself thinking about Mr. Thompson. She had heard that he was serving time for his crimes, but more importantly, his case had led to stronger protections for service workers across the state. "Sometimes," she told the children as they hung their artwork, "bad things happen so that we can learn how to make good things happen." It was a lesson she had learned through experience, one that had shaped her young life in profound ways. As the sun set on another busy day of making positive changes in their community, Rose and Joy sat on their balcony, sharing a quiet moment together. The city stretched out before them, filled with countless stories waiting to be told, countless truths waiting to be discovered through young, observant eyes. "Mama," Joy said, sketching the cityscape in her newest journal, "do you think we'll ever stop finding new ways to help people?" Rose smiled, watching her daughter carefully date and label her drawing. "No, baby," she replied. "I think we're just getting started." 18 months after the trial, Joy and Rose found themselves back at the courthouse. This time, they weren't there to face accusations but to celebrate the inauguration of the Young Voices program, a new initiative inspired by their story. The same imposing building that had once filled them with fear now stood as a symbol of positive change. The courthouse had transformed its children's waiting area into an art space where young people could document their experiences through drawing and writing. Joy's original drawing, the one that had changed everything, held a place of honor on the wall, protected behind glass but serving as an inspiration to everyone who passed by. Judge Williams, who had presided over their case, spoke at the inauguration ceremony. "Sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from our youngest citizens," she said, her stern courtroom demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "Joy taught us that justice isn't just about laws and procedures, it's about seeing the truth through unclouded eyes." Mrs. Chen stood nearby, watching her former clients receive recognition she knew they deserved. In the past year, she had helped establish a legal aid program specifically focused on helping service workers and their families. She called it the Rose Project, though Rose herself had blushed at the honor. "Your story showed us a gap in the system," Mrs. Chen explained to a group of law students who now interned with the program. "But more importantly, it showed us how to bridge that gap with compassion and dignity." The young lawyers-to-be took notes eagerly, many of them inspired by how a simple child's drawing had created such meaningful change. The hospital where Rose worked had become a model of workplace equality. The cleaning staff now participated in regular staff meetings, their insights valued in improving hospital operations. Rose's office, yes, she now had an office, displayed artwork from various children who had visited the hospital, each piece carefully dated and labeled in Joy's style. Dr. Thompson often brought visitors to Rose's department, proudly showing how their environmental services team had revolutionized hospital cleanliness and staff relations. When everyone feels valued, Rose would tell them, everyone works harder to maintain that trust. The Young Observers initiative had spread to schools across the country. Joy found herself video conferencing with students from different states, teaching them her observation techniques. She remained humbled despite her growing influence, always emphasizing that she had simply done what any child would do to protect their parent. The real power isn't in the drawing itself, she would explain to her young audiences. It's in paying attention to the world around you and standing up for what's right. Teachers reported that students who participated in the program showed improved academic performance and stronger social awareness. Mrs. Washington, their elderly neighbor who had stood by them through everything, had become something of a grandmother figure to all the children in their building. Her cookie baking sessions now included lessons in observation and documentation, teaching kids to measure ingredients carefully and record their cooking experiments. Every detail matters, she would say, echoing Joy's teachings. Whether you're baking cookies or seeking justice, paying attention to the little things makes all the difference. The children would nod seriously, carefully noting down recipe modifications in their observation journals. The art afternoons had evolved into a full-fledged community program, with similar groups starting up in neighborhoods across the city. Children were learning not just to draw, but to see, really see, the world around them and their place in it. Their observations had helped improve playground safety, identify needed repairs in school buildings, and even assist in city planning projects. One particularly touching moment came when a group of children presented their documented observations to the city council, pointing out areas in their neighborhoods that needed attention. The council members were impressed not just by the children's attention to detail, but by their constructive approach to solving problems. Rose's promotion to director hadn't changed her fundamental approach to work and life. She still walked through the hospital halls each day, greeting every employee by name. Remembering that dignity and respect are the foundations of any successful workplace. Her department had the highest employee retention rate in the hospital, and other institutions frequently sought her advice on staff relations. Joy's original drawing had inspired a new generation of young artists and observers. Art teachers across the country were incorporating documentation techniques into their lessons, teaching children that art could be both beautiful and purposeful. The Truth Through Young Eyes program had become part of many schools' standard curriculum. On a warm evening, as Joy and Rose prepared for another community art session, they received news that brought their journey full circle. The state legislature had passed a new law strengthening protections for service workers and establishing clear protocols for handling workplace disputes. The law was unofficially known as Joy's Law, though its official title was much longer and more formal. "Your daughter didn't just save you," Mrs. Chen told Rose as they celebrated the news. "She started a movement that's saving others and changing how we think about justice and dignity in the workplace." Rose hugged Joy close, remembering the frightened little girl who had once sat in a courtroom, speaking truth to power. The community gathered that evening for a special celebration. Children displayed their latest observation journals, proud parents admired the detailed drawings, and Mrs. Washington's cookies disappeared as quickly as she could bake them. The atmosphere was one of joy and achievement, but also of purpose and responsibility. As the sun set, casting long shadows across their transformed community, Joy sat with her mother on their familiar balcony. She was working on a new drawing, carefully documenting the celebration below. Though she had grown taller and her artistic skills had improved, she still maintained her habit of detailed observation and careful documentation. "Mama," Joy said, adding the date to her drawing, "remember when you used to tell me that sometimes life tests us?" Rose nodded, thinking of how far they had come from those difficult days. "I think the test isn't just about getting through hard times," Joy continued, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "It's about what we do with what we learn from them." Rose looked at her daughter, this remarkable child who had turned their personal struggle into a force for positive change. The little girl who had once drawn pictures to pass time while waiting for her mother had grown into a beacon of hope for others, showing that even the smallest voice could speak powerful truths. "You're right, baby," Rose replied, hugging her daughter close. "And you've taught me that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions, like a child paying attention and having the courage to speak up." Their story had come full circle, but it wasn't really an ending. Rather, it was a continuing journey of transformation, hope, and the power of truth seen through the eyes of a child. In courtrooms, classrooms, and communities across the country, their experience had sparked a movement that would continue to grow and evolve, touching lives in ways they might never know. As night fell over the city, Joy added the final touches to her drawing, capturing not just the scene below but the spirit of their journey, a journey that had begun with one careful observation and grown into a symphony of voices, young and old, all speaking their truths and making their world a little bit better, one drawing at a time.